Today we're going to talk about a squash that doubles as both a winter squash and a summer squash. It's resistant to the squash vine borer, and if you're short on space, it grows vertically, allowing you to save your other garden space for other crops. Let's talk about this squash known as the Tromboncino squash. The first thing you've got to love about the Tromboncino squash is that it is dual purpose. When the fruit starts setting, it begins as a really small green fruit, and then it progresses to a larger green fruit, and then it starts to change color from this green to this light greenish yellow, and finally to a deep yellow like a butternut squash. And so if you are able to go ahead and cut it early, you can use it like you would a summer squash or zucchini. Taste-wise, I would say that I still love my summer squash and zucchini. Tromboncino squash tastes more like a zucchini, I would say, than a summer squash. But if all you have in your garden in the middle of the season, as in your other squash plants, have succumbed to squash vine borer, which we're going to talk about in a minute, then this is a definite perfect option to be able to get summer squash all season long without having to worry about the borer or other issues. But then if you leave them on the vine to mature, then you've got a perfect butternut squash. Now, I have to admit, my family doesn't eat a lot of butternut squash, so as far as taste comparison between the Tromboncino and a typical butternut, I can't give you a comparison per se, but the way that I used them last year is I roasted them up, and some of the squash I used in a pumpkin bread or any kind of quick bread like that. It doubles for pumpkin very easily. I've also chopped it up and used it in stews, and it was really good in stews. But basically any place that you use butternut squash, Tromboncino is a good option. And because it is huge, you get so much food out of just that one squash. The reason I started growing the Tromboncino squash was because I had heard that it's resistant to the squash vine borer. And I have so much trouble with the squash vine borer. I plant multiple plantings of squash, which seems to work well for me. The early plantings, I just know they're going to be killed, so I just let them go. But I thought if there's a squash that I can get summer squash like fruit out of that might be resistant to the squash vine borer, then I'm going to try it. But I have to admit I was skeptical. I have lost so many squash plants to the squash vine borer, I wasn't sure that it would work. But last year I became a believer. The reason why the Tromboncino squash tends to be more resistant to the squash vine borer is because it's actually of a different plant species. It is the Cucurbita machata, which is different than your normal regular summer squash, which is Cucurbita pepo. Just fun fact. That's why this is more resistant, because the vine is more thick and dense, more like a true butternut squash than a summer squash. But I have to say that although the Tromboncino squash did not die of the squash vine borer, it is affected by it, but thankfully I've never had a major plant failure. So far in the last 2 years, there have been vines that have been affected, and I've had to cut down vines, but there haven't been any major, like, complete crop losses. And so for me, this is a great option to be able to put in my garden, because I know that even if it is affected by the squash vine borer, I'm not going to lose the entire plant. I'll still be able to get a good harvest. So take a look at this. This is my plant here. If you look at the base, this is one plant. Everything I'm going to show you is just from one plant. And if we look here, we follow this vine, which I've trimmed quite a bit as it's grown. You can see evidence here of the squash vine borer. There's even a squash bug in there, if you can tell, just kind of chilling out. But this is a telltale sign of the squash vine borer. And if I kind of move this out, it may or may not still be in there, because it looks like it's kind of an old, let's get that squash bug out. It looks like it's an old wound. But the plant here, even though you can tell that a squash vine borer has been here, a little roly-poly in there too, the plant has continued to support, or that vine has continued to support this plant all the way on this side and then over on the other side as well. So that's what I mean by resistant to squash vine borer. It doesn't mean they're not going to try, but it's not going to kill the plant. So how would you know that your squash plant was affected by the squash vine borer if it's not actually succumbing and dying? One way to know is that you might see some of these stems completely dead. And if you follow it up, you'll most likely see the place where the stem and the main vine meet. A lot of times you'll find that frass that's indicative of the squash vine borer. And in the past, I've been able to easily cut it and just dig out the borer. But even if I don't make it every time, the borer doesn't tend to go through the plant and actually kill it. It doesn't really make it very far, probably because of the denseness of the vine itself. Now let's talk about the growth habit of the plant, because it's something that you'll definitely need to know if you decide to grow Tromboncino squash. The main thing is that it will vine, and this makes it a perfect plant for vertical gardening. I have 2 arch trellises right here, and although I do have some sweet potatoes that are growing up one side and I have some cucumbers that are growing up another, this Tromboncino plant, which is one plant, has covered 1 arch trellis and also a 2nd arch trellis, and I have actually pruned it all season long. So this is one of those plants that when you give it warm to hot weather, it has done great in our 100-degree summer this year, then it's going to take over. As I mentioned, I have 1 plant growing right now. And the thing that is great about that is that obviously you grow 1 plant with good conditions, you'd be able to get a lot of food. Now, as far as growing it, I did start the Tromboncino squash seeds indoors, just like I started my other squash, as you can see in this video that we're linking above. And I transplanted it after the danger of frost has passed. It definitely loves warm weather, so try to make sure that you don't have any kind of frost coming, and if you do, cover it. And that's pretty much how I grew it. Set it and forget it. Make sure you have a drip line or some kind of watering system on it. But I found that in our 7 weeks of hardly any rain this summer, just a regular drip line without extra watering, it's done just fine. So it's really not a very fussy plant at all. Now, last year in 2021, I had a major problem with squash bugs. And I think the reason was because it was the only squash plant I still had left in my garden that the borer didn't take out. And so all the squash bugs descended. And I was fearful that that would happen this year, but so far I haven't seen that many. So I'm not sure if that's because the squash bug just kind of has its seasons where it goes crazy some years and then it's not so bad other years, or if it could be because maybe the squash bugs weren't as bad this year because we haven't had a lot of rain. I really don't know, but all that to say, if you do have trouble with squash bugs, definitely keep an eye on those egg clusters, because they will be up at the top, because that's the way that the squash plant does grow. As far as when to harvest your Tromboncino squash, if you're wanting to harvest it for a summer squash, I would harvest it when it's very young, probably less than 12 inches long, I would say, when it still is a deep green color. And then if you want to leave any on the plant like this one, you're going to want to wait until it's a very deep yellow, like you would other butternut squashes, and then you're just going to cure it in a cooler room in the house like you would other butternuts. I just stick it in the coolest room in my house. It doesn't have any light, and I let it just sit there for a few weeks, and then I will take it out and roast it and then preserve it if necessary. And usually it's necessary because with all of this, you just have a lot that you may not be able to eat in one sitting unless you have a really big family. But overall, to me, Tromboncino squash is a fantastic option. Whether you're just wanting something a little bit unique, a great talking point. Anytime you post any pictures of these, everybody's like, what is that? But it's also a great option if you want that dual purpose squash. If you deal with squash vine borers, I really think this is a great option for you. And then if you just love the beauty and you need the functionality of a vertical gardening crop that isn't beans or cucumbers, then the Tromboncino squash is a great option for you. Have you grown it before? What do you think? Is this something that you might be interested in your garden? If you would like more information on growing Tromboncino squash, I do have a podcast episode that I'm going to link in the show notes on the Beginner's Garden podcast that goes way more in depth on growing this unique squash so that you can see if it's what you would like to grow in your garden. Thanks for watching, and like and subscribe for more videos like this one.